the entire South seemed to somehow get the idea, and the question is, how did this occur? That their slaves loved them or attached to them. The people in the South were shocked out of their minds when the Northern armies got close, and all of a sudden, slaves are leaving the plantations in droves.
Right.
How did the Southerners get this idea?
In order to justify this system in their own minds, especially once the slaves are converted to Christianity. So now we're all Christians. In order to justify the enslavement of one Christian by another, it's necessary to say, not only am I doing it for the good of the other person, but that other person also recognizes that this is a beneficial arrangement from their point of view too. Well, if not democracy, at least paternalism or some version of that. These people are inferior. We know that they are inferior. They know, says the ideology, that they're inferior, and they are pleased to have somebody replacing their own inferior judgment with superior judgment, and so on and so forth. So in other words, this is a self-justification on the part of the planters, but also the slaves mirror this back to the slave owners for the sake of survival. Enslaved people learn to show a face toward the slave owners that they think the slave owners want to see. So Charles Colcock Jones Sr., the leading evangelist to the slaves in the South and himself a major Georgia planter, comments sometime before the Civil War that one can live one's whole life among blacks and never really see what they're thinking, because you're wise not to show what you're thinking. And you only show it, in the case of the Civil War, when opportunity allows you to show it without facing the death penalty or some other form of punishment in consequence.
But, which only proves that they're no fools.
Precisely.
Yeah. There was a guy whose name is lost to American history, but not to historians, whose name was Hinton Helper. And I think it was about 1854, he was North Carolinian, and about 1854, 1855, he wrote a book on what the South should do to get off this petard that was hoisted upon. Boy, did he catch that very devil, the traitor and this and that. So if the truth had occurred to you when you were a Southerner, you better keep your mouth shut, even if you're white.
Absolutely. Once upon a time, beginning of the 19th century, there were a fair number of Southern Protestant ministers who were preaching the necessity of gradually emancipating slaves. Well, they're eventually driven either out of the South or into silence or into recanting their views on the subject.
I don't want to get into specifics because people of this generation will, of course, disagree violently on the specifics, but I would have to say nothing's changed. It may not be slavery today. It may be other things. Shall we fight a war here? Shall we do this? Shall we do that? People take a position for which they get just utterly lambasted. So if you have any sense, you keep your mouth shut, because the rest of the country just doesn't want to hear it. I would say that there's a lot to that, but we owe a lot to people who, despite that, open their mouths, because at least it allows some other people who are a little bit more open-minded to have that light in, to let that light in. And we saw in the case of, for example, the Vietnam War, and there's here a slight parallel to the Civil War. I remember the beginning of the Vietnam War. By the way, the beginning of the war in Iraq. Everybody was gung-ho. Anybody who opened their mouths against the war was a traitor and a criminal and not supporting our troops and so on and so forth. But as in the case of the South and the Civil War, if that war goes on long enough and goes as badly as Iraq and Vietnam went, a large number of people who originally would have ridden you out of town on a rail become a little bit more open to what you have to say, perhaps.
This excerpt is brought to you by the Massachusetts School of Law, a leader of reform in legal education and a leader in multimedia education for the public. interview and for a full listing of MSL's programs, log on to mslaw.edu.